So meet me in Mark chapter 2. I'm going to try not to go back to my John study this morning. Let's go to a different gospel, and I want to take you into Mark's little gospel. Mark is an incredible little book. That goes without saying. I mean, he's a book about Jesus, but he's such a book of action and immediacy. You'll see what I mean in a moment. Before I read for you from the top of chapter 2, just kind of want to start with some questions, rhetorical, lay them out in the room, and let you dwell on them for a little bit as we minister today. Just start with the thought of, what is the value of someone else's faith to you? Because I think I can only really speak for myself, but for the most part, I have looked at faith as a personal thing that affects me. That my faith doesn't affect you. Your faith affects you. That I think is kind of common. People look at faith as a personal thing, not a corporate thing, particularly in the Protestant church. But I want you to just consider today what value that someone else's faith might have in your life. Conversely, what value might your faith have in your neighbor's life? And if your neighbor's too far gone or not easy for you to wrap your mind around, bring it into your house. What value does your spouse's faith have for you, or what value do you have, your faith have for your kids? That might be an easier way to think about it. And I'm not just talking about, well, I believe God's going to protect my kids and therefore my faith is valid for them. I want to go past that. That's you believing for protection. That's you being a good parent or a good spouse. What good spiritually does your faith do in the life of your neighbor? Does it do anything? And that's a big thing for me, is to try to dig down to the bottom of that. Does my faith in any way affect someone else's spirit man or someone else's soul? Or is this so individualistic that if I talk to you about salvation, it's really all just you? You believe, you receive, your neighbor believes for himself, he receives. How much of that comes together and how much of that is completely separate? Well, it's a question I haven't even really considered all that much, because I was just so convinced my faith was for me and your faith was for you, and neither shall the two meet, that I haven't put a lot of thought into it. And then I read stories like Mark 2, and I come across some pretty incredible moments in the life and ministry of Jesus. So let's read them starting in verse 1. Again, he entered Capernaum after some days, and it was heard that he was in the house. And immediately many gathered together, so that there was no longer room to receive him, not even near the door, and he preached the word to them. Then they came to him, bringing a paralytic who was carried by 4 men. And when they could not come near him because of the crowd, they uncovered the roof where he was. So when they had broken through, they let down the bed on which the paralytic was lying. And when Jesus saw their faith, highlight that moment in your text. That one's worth some more consideration. When Jesus saw whose faith? When Jesus saw their faith, he doesn't say to them, text is very specific. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the sick man. He sees their faith, and he speaks to the sick man of the sick of the palsy, and says, "Son, your sins are forgiven you." And some of the scribes were sitting there, reasoning in their hearts, "Why does this man speak blasphemy like this? Who can forgive sins but God alone?" But immediately, when Jesus perceived in his spirit that they reasoned this within themselves, he said to them, "Why do you reason about these things in your hearts? What is easier, to say to the paralytic, 'Your sins are forgiven you,' or to say, 'Rise, take up your bed and walk'?" That's a good question. Maybe I'll lay that one out there for you too. What's easier to say? "Son, your sins are forgiven you," or "Rise, take up your bed and walk"? Well, they're both easy to say, but which one's the easiest one to back up? So if you say to your neighbor, "Hey, you are forgiven of everything you've done wrong to me," or "Hey, you are healed of arthritis," which one's the easiest one to pull off? It's a simple question. There you go. So we got a conundrum in the ministry of Jesus. First of all, that Jesus asks the question, which one is easier to say? We're going to help him. He's going to help us answer that as we move forward in the text. So which one's easier to say? "But so that you may know that the Son of Man has power on earth to forgive sins," he said to the paralytic, or to the sick of the palsy. That's what palsy is paralysis. "I say to you, rise, take up your bed, go to your house." Immediately, And I don't know if you've caught a trend here. This is 3 times in 12 verses that the word immediately has kicked off a verse. This is a very Mark thing to do. 9 times in chapter 1, Mark says immediately, to the point that it's absurd when you read it out loud. It's like the writer that can't come up with another word. He keeps going back to the same word over and over again. Mark chapter 1, he uses it 9 times. In the 16 chapters of the book of Mark, he uses immediately 40 times. That's akin to falling in love with a term. But I don't think it's because Mark's a bad writer. I think Mark preaches a Jesus with a sense of immediacy. That Jesus walks into a room and gets to work. There's not a lot of talking in Mark. Jesus doesn't teach much. He moves more. If you want the talking Jesus, read Matthew. He talks like crazy. Chapter after chapter after chapter of talking. If you want the moving and acting Jesus, read Mark, because he's the immediacy Jesus. Immediately he rises up, takes up his bed, and went out in the presence of them all, so that all were amazed and glorified God, saying, we never saw anything like this. Or as old King James says so eloquently, we never saw it done on this fashion. And so we have Jesus in a room, packed to the gills. No one can get in. The text is even careful to tell you, not even at the door, which is kind of the way you get into rooms. I've always thought that was a bit redundant for Mark to remind you that not even could they get in through the door. But he's trying to set you up for one of the more bizarre moments in the ministry of Jesus. A moment where they tear the roof off of a house and lower a paralyzed man into the middle of a crowded room, which means the people had to depart in some fashion. They probably lower him very near Jesus. And Jesus then moves on a paralyzed man who hasn't expressed an ounce of faith, who didn't ask for forgiveness, who didn't ask to be healed, but he recognizes the faith of 4 men in the room and begins to move on the heart and the body, starts with the heart, moves to the body of the paralyzed man. So I come back to my opening question. What good is someone else's faith to you? Well, based on Mark 2, it's a lot of good. Because based on Mark 2, somebody else's faith may help you to rise up from your sick bed and walk. Or somebody else's faith may introduce you to the gospel of forgiveness. And that's a pretty good gospel. That's good news. I'm forgiven of my sins, and someone cared enough to let me know about it.